Please be seated. Responsible parents that we were, Ardell and I did our best to shame our children into good behavior whenever possible. Fortunately for us, there's an entire publishing industry out there at our disposal. Christian children's books can be a great help to shame-based parenting. A memorable one we used to read to our firstborn was called Casey the Greedy Young Cowboy, a book about being thankful. I won't spoil the book's intricate plot for those who haven't read it. Suffice it to say that after little Casey was tempted to run away at the rodeo because his parents wouldn't buy him all the cool cowboy stuff he'd seen on television, the scales fell from the boy's eyes, and he understood that his mother and father were actually perfectly loving and wise, and that he'd been acting like a selfish brat. I mean, what's not to like? Well, this book, anyway, was in regular rotation for Alden until one day when Ardell was on chauffeur duty, and a 4-year-old voice piped up from the back seat and said, "Mom, you know that book about Casey, the greedy young cowboy? Well, it might be fun for you, but it's not very fun for me." And he burst into tears. Finally, we were getting somewhere with this boy. No, all right. I don't actually think that shame is a helpful force in parenting or in our moral lives in general. But do you remember when stories had the power to disturb you? I mean, really disrupt the way you understood and responded to the world. Do you remember when you allowed yourself to trust and enter a story deeply enough to let it challenge your most basic orientation toward the world? I worry it's been too long for me. Grown-ups, and by grown-ups I mean anybody over the age of about 7, grown-ups learn to explain things. Grown-ups learn to tell each other what a story's about, which is a helpful way of creating a safe and insulating distance between us and any story that might otherwise hit a little too close to home, right? If you get really good at diffusing the power of story into a puddle of benign explanations, you might even become a preacher. So granting that most of us in this room are past the age of 7 and that a preacher is about to begin prattling on about the parable of the unjust tenants, let's at least set as an intention for ourselves, letting this story disrupt the way we see the world. Let us see if it'll disrupt us, if it will, if only for the next few minutes. Can we do that? This parable has all the trappings of a good Western, actually, doesn't it? It starts with a landowner leasing his vineyard to a bunch of bad eggs. When he sends people to collect the produce that he's owed, the tenants beat up the first one, they kill the second, they stone the third. So the story begins with unambiguous injustice perpetrated by the unambiguously bad guys. But like the sheriff who kind of remains calm and above the moral fray for a while, the landowner says, "I'm going to give him one last chance. I'm going to send my son over. If those scoundrels know what's good for them, they'll treat him right." Of course, we all know what happens when a line gets drawn in the dust in these movies, don't we? The bad guys just step across it with an even greater swagger, setting the stage for the deep satisfaction that comes from watching somebody bad get exactly what they've got coming. It's what we bought our tickets to see, right? It's what we bought our tickets to feel. Apparently, this Western genre, or at least its basic ethos, was well established back in Jesus' day. Because Jesus doesn't even have to finish the parable himself, does he? He leaves the story's obvious conclusion to his listeners. He says, "So what happens next to the tenants?" And the priests and the Pharisees say, "Well, he will put those wretches to a miserable death and lease the vineyard to others who will give him the produce at harvest time. Justice will finally be done when the landowner comes to town. He's going to make things right." Of course, we now know that whatever the chief priests and Pharisees say in these stories is supposed to be wrong. What we don't expect is that if you and I could hear this story with the open heart of a 4-year-old, we'd almost surely find ourselves not safely over on Jesus' side, but squirming in our car seats as the parable cuts right into our most basic, most natural responses to an unjust world. Read the story again. All the chief priests and Pharisees do is finish this parable like almost every satisfying story we've ever heard ends. Somebody's finally got the gumption or the wit or the brute force to give the bad guys their just desserts. It's the oldest and most reliable plot hinge of them all. But when Jesus hears it, he says something ridiculous. He says, as long as that's the way your stories end, you'll never see the kingdom of God. You'll trip over the stone the whole kingdom's actually built upon. You'll trip on the strange logic of the cross, because the cross makes no sense at all to the redemption stories human beings tell. You see, the people in Jesus' day had a very clear image of what the Messiah would do and be. He would be a violent redeemer. Clearly their world needed one. The Messiah would take on the unjust powers on their own terms, and he would destroy them. In other words, their imagined Messiah was exactly like the Messiahs we imagine everywhere else in our lives. Their imagined Messiah looked just like the heroes in all of our stories, in all of our movies, on all of our sports and battlefields, in all of our political fights. A Messiah is still somebody powerful enough to set things straight, right? For Christians, no less than for anybody else, it seems. Which is a sobering thing to realize about myself. Because suddenly we're the ones Jesus turns to and says, the kingdom of God is being taken away from you. You have no access to it while your minds are spinning off into score-settling justice. In God's good kingdom, redemption looks like the cross. It looks like vulnerable, selfless, perfect reception of the world's violence into the loving body of Jesus. And it looks like a divine refusal to send any of that violence back out into the world. In the kingdom of God, redemption looks like love. The cross's disruption of our violent redemption stories goes all the way down to the stones of their foundations, all the way down to our most basic impulses to make things right, which is why we too stumble over what's supposed to hold the whole structure of Jesus' way up. We trip over the cross as we say, surely Jesus can't be asking us to meet this violent world armed only with a selfless and vulnerable love, which is to say, surely Jesus can't expect us to do what he told us to do. Surely we can't expect us to live the way he lived to the end. This has been a terrible and a poignant week to be thinking and praying over this parable for me. It was a week ago tonight that the news of the shootings in Las Vegas began to light up our phones, flash across our television screens, drop into our inboxes. We are still stunned and bewildered and grieving. But a week later, the question we seem to be asking most is, what was his motive? Why did he do it? 100 investigators following 1,000 leads, and we still don't feel any closer to this why. It is disturbing not to know a killer's motives. But shouldn't it be even more disturbing that we usually do? Because we may not comprehend arbitrarily taking innocent life, but we do know about score settling. I do know about the urge to bring this universe back into some moral alignment by force. I do know the desire to put those miserable wretches to a miserable death. People may disagree about who the miserable wretches are, but how much of this world's violence is driven by these utterly familiar urges to make things right? The violence that killed Jesus certainly was. Friends, how many of the 153 homicides so far this year in Memphis were too? Don't you think the stories behind the statistics would tell of unfaithful lovers and thefts, of lies and double crosses, of authority disrespected and orders disobeyed in little kingdoms all over this town? How much of our violence feels like righting something that's wrong? The Christian gospel is that this violent world will never be redeemed by more violence. We will not bring the peace of Christ by being better armed or by being put more fully in charge of the world. To think so is to deny the cross. And to trust its subversive wisdom is to have our stories of what redemption looks like disrupted all the way down. It's a wisdom in a way we will stumble over again and again and again until by grace all the old stories of violent redemption crumble and we begin to believe. Until we believe that in the one that wouldn't give violence back, even as violence was putting him to death. Until we believe in the redeeming power of a love that rose again. A love that is still alive, still waiting for us to stop tripping over it and trust it. A love that made us and was meant to drive and transform and redeem every last one of our stories all along.